Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Pursuit of Purpose. I remain your humble host, Chris Dunham. We have had a great year in terms of attraction and increase in the digital reach of these messages and missives. Nothing extravagant, nothing grand, but the workers of the podcast and the YouTube channel have said that our growth, organic as it been, has had great success. The number of countries that we reach now increased to over 25, and the digital footprint keeps growing. I took a little hiatus from some of the recordings because I was traveling and then came under the weather a little bit. All's well, though, in the Dunham household. As we head into this holiday season, as you can see, bright red signifying what goes on out there, I want to share with you a few thoughts and ideas about this thing called the promise. I've titled this message, The Promise Keeper. God, in fact, is the greatest promise keeper. He's a promise keeper that began before time began. He's a promise keeper that continues to deliver on his promises during our time. And he's a promise keeper for the hereafter. I know those of you who are watching and listening to this have probably had your share of doldrums this year or over the couple of years, and you're wondering whether this promise really has a manifestation for you. As we head into Christmas, we begin to realize that this particular holiday is a universal holiday. So people from every worldview begin to wish each other. You go into malls in parts of the world where Christ is not the predominant figure, and you begin to realize that the joy of giving, the joy of celebrating, the joy of adding lights in your home, the joy of creating festivity, because it is universal, creates a sense of calm around people. But I think there's a little more of a serious note to take here when you look at the promise of God and his deliverance on that promise. So the first component is to realize that the prophecy of a promise. Now, when I call this the promise keeper, I'm hearkening back to the days in America when we had these big gatherings called the promise keeper gatherings, where people would come and gather in arenas and mainline Christian speakers would speak. And this thing kind of lit up the Western Hemisphere, and people tried to replicate that in other parts of the world. And eventually that movement had its own fragmentation or its little going off into different directions that was more manageable. But that said, let's assume God himself one day called a meeting of all of humanity. And in doing so, he says, I want everybody to assemble who's been a promise breaker. That there would not be enough place on earth to fit that many people in one spot who have broken God's promises. But God, on the other hand, has been a promise keeper. So first step I want you to look at, before we look at the birth of the child that is going to come at Christmas, let us look at the prophecy from Isaiah 9:6, made over 700 years ago, where it says that unto you the son is given, but the child is born. So the child is born so that we can have a human aspect to the divinity of Christ. God keeps his promise 700 years later when it says that the child is born in the confines of Bethlehem, born in a manger to Mary, comes as a virgin birth because of the uniqueness of the need for the fact that that child had to be sinless and spotless. But let's go back to Isaiah 700 years ago, because what he says before the birth of Christ, 700 years before the birth of Christ, he says, unto you the son is born, the son is given, but the child is born, which means the son existed before time, existed with God. The promise is then delivered into a child. But the next part of Isaiah 9:6 talks about on his shoulders will rest the governments, and we will call him Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now, all of these, if you look at the book of Micah, where the prophecy is given as to where he will be born, there is something specific. So these are all declarations that took place long before the event that we celebrate. Now, the event we celebrate, we also celebrate just as an anniversary, because at the end of the day, he would have to be born every year if we were going to try to do this in a different way. And that's why we just celebrate the anniversary. Same with Easter. We basically, he would have to die, every Friday, so to speak, and rise every Monday for it to work or Sunday for it to work. So these are anniversaries, but they are celebratory anniversaries that bring us together in the unison of this promise. So the first thing is, the prophecy of this promise is a declaration. Isaiah says that the son is given, the child is born, but more importantly, on his shoulders will be the king, will be the governments, the principalities of the world would rest on his shoulders. Now you look at the next part, is the proof of the promise. The proof of the promise is exactly where and how it would take place. And this goes back to Luke 2:11. In Luke 2:11, the angel comes and tells unto you, in the city of David, a child is born, who will be the Savior of the world, who is Christ the Lord. So suddenly, with this promise that is offered as a prophecy is now a promise of proof. Now, one of the things of promises that you and I who are listening to this or watching this begin to realize is that broken promises are the hardest things to manifest, and it kind of leaves us in the doldrums. As a father, I know I have disappointed my son many a time. And the tears in his eyes that well up when I make a promise to him and I break a promise to him because of some other extenuating circumstances, or because I'm a dad and I can change my mind, is the words the child usually uses, but Daddy, you promised. When we look at our eternal Father and we say, but Daddy, you promised, he delivers on his promise. Now the problem with promises and the breaking of the promises, there's always hope that there is something else coming when it comes from God. There is pain in the anguish of the waiting, but there is comfort in the assurance that that waiting will soon culminate in the fulfillment of his promise. There is no such thing in this world called anticipatory grief, though many of us grieve it. We grieve things that have not happened, and as a result, we live with hopelessness while we're supposed to have hope. So in this season, as we celebrate these lights and as we celebrate the exchange of gifts, focus on the promise keeper that is God. The first premise being the promise, the prophecy of the promise. The second is the prophecy as a proof. But the third thing is the patience of the promise. So the first thing is the prophecy of a promise. The second is the proof of a promise. And the third is the patience of a promise. You go to Psalm 13, and if you follow me online or you follow me on Instagram or LinkedIn, I posted some time back a poem I wrote on Psalm 13. And I'd encourage you, if you want a copy of that, please just send an email to our office at info@skylifesuccess.com. I very rarely break away from the course of my message to do a plug, but I think this poem resonated with people all over the world. Make sure that you go and send that email to us, info@skylifesuccess.com or krish@krishdunham.com, and ask for this poem, which was written on Psalm 13, which talks about how long do I wait, O God? And this is the patience that is required at this time in our generation where we have become an instant gratification society. Think about it. Many people will be disappointed on Christmas morning, not because the Savior came and the Savior didn't deliver, but the fact that their parents, as earthly Santas, did not give them the gift they thought they wanted, got them something less substantial than they expected, or because of the times couldn't afford anything at all. Now, I don't want to be a Scrooge here or a Grinch here at Christmas time, and I know there's a lot of celebration, but I downplay this thing of whole gift giving. The other day, my wife and I were shopping around, and she bought a purse, and she says, "This is a little more than I usually spend on a purse." I said, "Sweetheart, you deserve it." She says, "Well, what the heck? It'll be my Christmas gift." And I thought so much that we have anticipatory grief, but we don't have anticipatory joy. Why not buy your gifts in June when you can afford them, and not wait till the end of the year when you have to afford them? Why not buy them and give them to people during the course of the year? Here's why. Christ is a gift that keeps on giving. While his day is a birth that is to be celebrated all over the world because it demarcates, punctuates human existence, his entire existence kind of bifurcates the calendar of old and the calendar of new. The bottom line is Christ is a gift that keeps on giving. He's a gift, and is a gift that has given since the beginning of time and before time and will continue to do after time. And that's why Isaiah's prophecy is so powerful. For unto us a child is born, but the son is given. The child is born, but the son is given. And the son is given as an eternal gift from eternity past to eternity future. So why don't we exchange this concept of gift giving throughout the course of the year? Now, it doesn't have to be lavish. It doesn't have to be extravagant. It doesn't have to be dear in terms of its price. But it's just a token of affection. Now, why does there even have to be a gift of exchange to tell somebody you care about them? Years ago, coming up through the ranks as a motivational speaker, I heard this statistic given by, I think, a study done by Cavett Robert, which said very simply that every night 3 billion people go to bed hungry for food, but 4 billion people go to bed hungry for a word of encouragement. Now, that was written at the time when the world's population was about 6.5 billion, or maybe tipping 7 billion. Now we got 8 billion, so the numbers may have expanded substantially. The number of people walking around in this world that are hopeless is just staggering. We try to ask governments to answer us. We try to ask principalities to be accountable to us. We try to ask our businesses and our employers. Ask yourself this question. If you owned your own business, how much scrutiny do you go through in making sure that the entire business is perfect when it's presented to authority either through legality or through monetary aspects of accountability in the tax system? We pay our attorneys a lot of money and we pay our accountants a lot of money so that they can trim away everything that is improper or something that does not meet the muster of existing law. And we do that annually. How come we don't do an annual soul check and ask ourselves, is there something wrong? Am I a walking catastrophe? Am I a casualty of culture? Charles Spurgeon put it this way: to most people who walk through life, who believe that this is the great gift that we get at Christmas, and unto us a child is born, but joy to the world, the Savior is come, it seems salvation is just a solution. It seems eternity is an expectation. It seems hell is just something that is harmless because, hey, if you don't talk about it enough, let's focus on heaven. More importantly, death then just becomes an inconvenience. So we wander through life as meaningless generalities instead of trying to be a meaningful specific. So how do we tie this together and ask ourselves, how can I abide by the truth of the promise keeper? First, I have to understand that the promise comes from prophecy. And in order to understand the promises of God, we have to go back in time and ask ourselves, how many of his prophetic promises have come to pass? Right down to where he was born, right down to the fact that he will bear the sins of humanity, right down to the fact that he would die for our transgressions, right down to the fact that his body would bear the scars and stripes of humiliation. Second, we have to ask ourselves if this promise that God has given us through all of time has proof. And we look for that proof in our existence. You know, my mentor, Mr. Ziegler, always used to say, when you look at your bride through the eyes of Christ, you will see a forgiven woman. If the God of the universe can forgive her, who are you to find fault with her? And I like that simplicity because what it does is it gives chronological proof to existence. Sometimes in our lives, the love of God has got to meet the logic of his existence. The logic of his existence is the grandeur and beauty, a bird chirping, a sunrise, a sunset, a cloud break, a tree, a leaf, a flower, a fruit. These are all majestic representations of the beauty of God. So there is proof of his promise just about everywhere. If you go back to Garden of Eden and you look at the promises given to God, if you look at the Old Testament covenant that God made to Noah, you look at all through the New Testament, we see those promises coming. So first we have to ask ourselves, where is this promise prophesied? Second, we need to ask ourselves, how has this promise been proved? And third, which is the hardest part, is asking ourselves, do I have the patience to be a recipient of the promise? Now, if you've accepted Christ as your Lord and Savior, there's no harm, no foul. But as E. Stanley Jones said, we have inoculated this world with a mild form of Christianity, so it's almost immune against the real thing. In this day and age, we hear a lot about immunization and vaccinations and all of the components that go therein. but there is an inoculation that needs to take place in our hearts so that our soul gets that adjustment and asking ourselves, am I willing to examine annually around this time whether my soul has been in tune with the promise of God, with the expectation He has from me, with believing Him and canvassing Him, sharing Him, I am being obedient to Him. Hopefully this message has given you a little clarity, a little hope, and a little guidance. Well, good luck and God bless, and hope everything else works out for you. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.